Great stuff. Thank you. Afternoon, everybody. So we're going to go through quite a whirlwind here. So let me just give you first up what I think you're going to get from this session. So I'm going to talk about custom connectors as the title says, but this isn't going to be a straight up connect to an API. It's as easy as that. I'm going to take it from a different angle. I'm going to take it from the angle that, yes, we've heard about lots of connectors, and we've heard that custom connectors are very useful to connect to your own organization data. But the main thing is the standard connectors just don't cut it. If we're going to talk about app platform, custom connectors to your own data is where we really need to go. So I'm going to touch a lot on that. Problem with this is this session is for the audience of those makers out in the solution, so business app makers. But these things are hard. Trying to have conversations with those in the business about custom APIs, custom connectors, these conversations are very difficult because the topic is quite inaccessible for the regular builder. I'm going to cover some of that today, particularly some of the core topics around APIs, REST APIs, JSON properties, and so on, just to try and enlighten a little, and so you can have that conversation with the pro devs. And pro devs are going to build the custom connectors, and those in the business are going to use and reuse them. So I'm going to touch a little upon that. And lastly, I like Power Automate, so this isn't a vendetta against that. But the point of this session is that we don't need flow, and I'll explain why as we go. A little about me, here I am. I run the business applications practice for Cognizant Microsoft Business Group in the UK, and I've been in the space a long time. Dynamics for 13 or so years. I see Mark Cotton's on the window there. He and I were doing stuff back in the day, and Cognizant are big in the UK, not big in biz apps in the UK. Well, not yet. Our earlier incarnation, New Signature, was a Microsoft Partner of the Year a couple of years back, and we're award-winning in other areas of data platform and Azure Infra particularly. But biz apps are new for us, and we're going big in it, specifically in Dynamics Sales Service, and central to that is Power Platform. But the rest of this is about me and the topic. So here's what I'm going to cover off, a bit more detail. The demand for apps. I'm going to cover why everyone in the business needs to be thinking about building apps. I'm going to talk about API, and I'm going to unashamedly go into some pretty jargonistic terms just so that you understand them and can take them away and start to discuss them in your organizations. When I first started looking at this, my face looked like that. In terms of the structure, I'll be talking through that structure of the APIs and explaining, as I mentioned earlier, why no flow. There'll be some demos, and we'll get to them. I've got a few in the bank here, and I'll pick the ones that I think are right based on the time I've got. But mostly, I'm going to be focusing on how we're going to interact with the APIs, both from a querying it in terms of getting information from that API, but also how we can give information to the API to go and do something, and that will be the post. And then lastly, I'll cover off with a little bit about Test Studio and Dynamics 365 Dataverse. All of the bottom row is going to focus on dot notation, so how we're going to use that to access the properties of the APIs. It sounds a bit demystifying, but it won't. I want to expand a little upon why we need this. Yes, we've seen this graph a lot before. This is well trailed. The digital transformation is driving the need for apps and solutions outside of those that typically would have built them in the past. So we need to not only give the tools to the people in the business to build this stuff, addressing that long tail that's spoken about down here, but also we need to expand upon some of the insights and the terminology, because we can't just say, here's a custom API to our widgets data source. We need to explain it so that people can understand it. If they don't understand it, they can't use it. So my argument here is, yes, we need those in the business to build out these apps and solutions in order to embrace the scale of change that's needed. But that scale of change can't be met by small productivity apps. A little app over a SharePoint list is great, but that's not going to transform your business. Transforming the business means you need to surface the data that's in your business. And yes, you need to clean it up first, but that's more Matt's thing than mine. And I'm going to talk about proper apps. So proper apps need access to your organization data. And often a custom connector is the only thing that can bring that to the fore. So why do we need custom connectors? We've got so many connectors already. Yes, we do. Hundreds of them, don't we? Problem is, some of them don't do exactly what we need it to do. And absolutely right, those standard connectors don't connect to your organization's data. So in this list on the left, you're not going to find a connector out to Crunch, your finance ledger, or Widget, your parts list. This is where the custom connectors come in. So let's talk about REST API. What is a REST API? And it's at the core of a custom connector. So it's important we understand some of these terms. So breaking it down a little. What is it? An API is a way of two platforms speaking to one another. So one platform asks a question or gives an instruction, and the other answers that question with some information or confirms that it's done and gives some information back. So REST, not SOAP. What is REST? Well, it's an architectural style. It's a way of implementing these APIs. And it's important that it's distinguished from the old style of APIs. You may have heard in your organization SOAP, XML. I doubt it if we're talking business terms, but in conversations with your IT pros, maybe we've talked about this in the past. REST is where we need to be at. Let's talk about the methods. So different ways of forcing an operation to that API, asking the API to do something. So these are all standard terms within the REST language set. So we talk about a GET. It's where you go and get some information that is already existing there. A POST is where you want to create new at the data source, or you want to also pass some information into the data source. And patch sounds familiar, doesn't it? If you've built Canvas apps, you'll be familiar with the word patch. But patch is a way of updating an existing thing. Other parts of APIs that are important to understand, headers. Headers are how we pass information over to the target API. An example of that may well be this. Application JSON is a way of saying to the API, I'm going to talk to you in JSON. And request. So here you can either go and get everything, or you can also get a filtered something. And in doing so, you may be able to filter that data source based upon passing in some information, either in the header or the path, or by what's called a query string. And you'll know what a query string is. If you look at a URL, and it's got a question mark and then some stuff after, that's a query string. And response. So here's the really important part of the API. So when we talk about the responses, it might be that a response from the API is when you're creating a record, so a post, the response might be something like an order number. That's important for you to receive and use that in the context of Canvas apps, which is what we're framing this in today. Another response may well be where you're just looking up a record, so as part of a GET method, for example. And that lookup might be a customer record that's responded back, for example. Now, last couple of things on here. So body is important. This is the defined structure of what's going to come back or what's going to go across. And that's important. Remember, I said it's the JSON is this language that the two platforms talk together with. So it's important that they know the language that they're speaking. And then JSON itself, what is? We've heard, but what is it? It's a collection of properties where there's a name and a value. So within that name and value, we may have a continent be the name and the value be Europe, for example. Now, in Excel terms, think of it as the name is the column header and the value is the cell value in the middle, so Europe. Okay, break this down a little more. We're going to need these terms as we get through the content. So getting a little bit school now. So JSON array, what is an array? Important thing, the square brackets. This is an identifier of a JSON array. What is an array? It's a list of records or objects, more specifically. Now in Canvas apps, these are called tables. Helpful in some ways, not necessarily helpful if you're talking to your Fusion team pro dev about needing a list of records. They may well want to use terms like array. These are the terms. JSON for object. So what is it? It's a set of properties for a particular record. So a contact in Dynamics 365 has lots of properties. A contact is an object. Now in Canvas app terms, these are called records. Makes a bit more sense. Interestingly, not row. I'm going to leave that one there. Importantly, you can have objects within objects as well. And as an example of that would be here. So we have languages as a property of this object. And within that, there is an object and properties of the object. Primary language, secondary language. Now, what happens when you need more than 2 languages? That's where we get nesting going on. So we could have a list of records that is an array. Instead of those fixed 2 properties of primary and secondary, we could have a list of records within that, an array of records within that. In Canvas apps terms, a table of records within that. And here you'll see we have languages with 3 records within it. So that's quite important concepts for us to understand. And here's an example of how that looks within Canvas apps. So these 3 records would be under languages, and this is what it looks like. You've seen that before, right? Rather unhelpfully, it's the same icon for object, and the 2 are very different things. One goes up, one goes down. Okay, let's get to some of the demo. School time's over, and what I'm going to cover next is the scenario. So we have a single object that is a record with some nested objects underneath. And I'm going to use a publicly available API for this, which is the UK government. It's a very nice API if you're looking to get started with some, very well structured. And I've built a custom connector that wraps around the front. And in that, I'm going to pass a piece of information. So in my case, I'll be passing a name of a country as part of the URL path. And I'll be using a custom connector to do this. And then the response, I'll be showing you how it comes back in JSON format. And importantly, as we go through, I'll be explaining the dot notation and how that's useful in order to get at the properties within that response. So this is what it looks like. There will be a live demo. But in essence, it's taking it from that URL at the bottom of the screen there. If you went to that, you would see the web version of that. But the way that the government have structured their API is their website content effectively uses the API to render that content. Very nice for us to be able to use it and reproduce it in our own app, as I've done here. Let me explain some of the structure using these new terms that we have. So this table on the left-hand side effectively describes what's on the right-hand side. So we have an object called details, and that's highlighted here. And within that, we have an object called country. And within that, we have name and slug. These are real properties names, by the way. Interesting, they may well seem. And then document has a inner property in an object called URL. And then summary is also there too, but it's too far down to show. But let me take you through setting up a connector to the API so that we've got a basis to be able to do the demo in the Canvas app. So I've pre-recorded this just for speed purposes, but I'll talk over it just so that you get a feel for what goes on. In this example, I've got a simple combo box which goes to a static list of countries. And there I will be picking the name of the country to then retrieve from the API, which is UK FCDO, into a global variable. Now, showing you the API, if I show you the get country action, it needs a country to be passed into it in order to then go and get the information. And that is passed in from the combo box, as it shows on here. So if I select and just show you what goes on in the global variable, which is where I'm storing that now, and you'll see we have the response body nicely structured. So taking it back to where we had some of the properties under details, and within the country, and then from other properties, in nested objects within there, we have the URL under the document object, and we have others. And how they're mapped within the Canvas app, you'll see response body is what comes back from the API, details, country, name, ... So it's going further down the tree. Same with details and summary and country name. Now, if I wanted to change that, you'll see I can pick other properties of the object and go up to response if I chose to do something else. So document dot brings me the URL that's further within. Putting it back to what it was. Now, we could have used flow for this, but I'm going to show you why I chose not to. If we use monitor, which is the debugging console, I've got an equivalent one where this combo box runs a flow, and that flow effectively does the same thing. It calls the API and returns the country that matches the input, in this case, the same country. But if I show you in monitor the difference between the two, the first one is our API call directly in the custom connector, and it's 293 milliseconds, 0.3 of a second. Flow is more than double that. What we also have back in the custom connector was the full JSON payload, the full JSON body. But in the flow, because of some constraints, I was having to define some output parameters from the flow, picking out parts of that. So that's limiting. Not only does it take longer, but I'm also fixing to that flow the response schema. And I didn't want to do that. So there's the comparison of how to set it up and use it within both a direct custom connector and why I chose no flow in that situation. Just wrapping up some of the points from there. Performance is an important one, remember, double. It's simpler. So in the flow, I would have had to, and did, had to use things like parse JSON. These may well be actions very familiar to you if you're used to building flows. I would have then had to have selected properties of that JSON. I would have had to have selected individual output properties to put back in the response to the Canvas app, and I didn't choose to do this. But that would have made it a lot simpler in doing it in the custom connector, where I can bind the app to the custom connector and then directly use the properties in dot notation within the Canvas app directly. A lot more straightforward. API calls are an important consideration for us here. If we can get away with fewer API calls by doing it through a custom connector, that's great. We all know why. And lastly, in terms of the JSON body, we get full if we use a custom connector. There are ways to do it to get the full JSON payload back through a flow into the Canvas app as well, you know, using this down here, the request response, but that's premium. And in so doing, that may well be a deterrent for some. whereas the respond to Power Up or Flow is standard. Yes, you may well be thinking, if I'm using custom connectors, then that's already premium, Rob. Yeah, not through Dataverse for Teams. Okay, on to the next one. I'm aware that this is quite a pace, so maybe you'll be able to watch it back in half speed and hear me go through some of these terms a little slower next time. But I want to keep going. The purpose of this session is to stretch knowledge. So post now. So remember the definition of post, we're wanting to either create a record or pass some information that an API will use to then give us something back, using that same custom connector method that we looked at earlier, but this time a different one. So in this case, I've created my own API, which just gives a very straightforward customer record back and in a lookup type scenario here. So what is it? It's a single object. Again, I didn't want to show you having nested arrays or tables within that. That has different implications when we come to use it within Canvas apps, and this is already quite deep. What I also want to give you is an insight into what a pro dev would go through to build up this custom connector in the first place, to set it up, but that will be quite brief. Mostly this is then going to be about how in Canvas apps you would pass this over into the API using the custom connector and then be able to interpret the response, again using dot notation. So here's the structure. So left-hand side is the more intelligible bit. So we have customer details, and within customer details, we have a contact details, we have account details, primary contact, and customer at that first inner level. And we have a nested object, like our earlier example. So under contact details, we also have primary address and billing address. Now, again, these are fixed properties, so they're objects. None of these are arrays, and that's further identified by the curly brace there, not the square bracket. Okay, so that's our structure. Just real quick, I'll talk over how we go about creating that custom connector. Starting with an Azure function. So this is just a simple endpoint, a simple URL that the custom connector is going to go to. And it will always return, for the purposes of this demo, it will always return the same thing, that same customer record. So creating myself an action from within this, and lookup client stub is the action. And I'm going to want to make it a post because I want to pass over a customer number and then have this API respond to me with the customer record that matches that. So I need to tell it a header is application JSON, and the body is simply the customer number property, ABC9876 as an example. I need to add a secure key so that I'm permitted to call the Azure function. Again, pro devs are going to handle all of this. This is just to give you an insight into what goes on. And once I've created that key, I can then go create myself a connection and then test. And we need to be able to test it so that we can not only know it works, but also we get to see the body. Okay, so now that we've got that custom connector there, imagine that this is now a custom connector on the shelf. Pro dev teams built it out, and we can now use that in any number of Canvas apps throughout our organization as business app makers. Very useful thing to do. So this one next is going to be showing you how we use that API using the custom connector and wiring it up to a Canvas app. So let's bring it in first. This is just an example of me getting some new controls on the screen here. So again, I've got a simple text box, and next I'm going to be adding a command. or a buttons, you could so choose it to be. And this is going to allow us to push through to the API using the custom connector, the customer number. And I'll need to drag on something that will allow me to put in the response from the custom connector. And in this case, it will be the match customer details. Okay, so from here, I can then have an area where I can put in my ABC-9876 customer number and see the response that comes through mapped into a global variable, as I will set it to be here. So I want a global variable, lookup client, and I need to define then where I'm going to call. So I need to bring in my custom connector, stub response, selecting the connection, and now it's available to me. Lookup client stub, remember, was the action I named in the custom connector, and I need to pass in the body. So this is a post. I need to pass in a body of the customer number and the content type. And once I've done this, I can then hit the API after binding it through to the field where I've got on there for the customer number, and then do my first hit to see what happens. And when I do so, it's going to give the response to the Canvas app straight off. And I can see the results in the global variable. Now, problem, that says true. So I need to go back into my debugging to find out what's going on here. I was expecting to see the full JSON body. The problem I've got is this, PA binary. Now this means that the Canvas app can't read it as JSON. So it hasn't defined it in the custom connector, something to watch out for. So if I go back into my custom connector and instead I grab from my test here, the body, and I'll define that as my schema, the body that needs to go back as a response. And it is this that the Canvas app will then be able to use in the dot notation that I mentioned earlier on, making it the language of application JSON within the header that goes back in the response. Now, if I go back into my app, I can remove the connector that was there before because it doesn't refresh. This is one of the problems. We don't have a refresh option. So copy out that expression that I had. I'll remove it, add the connector back in, and then put my expressions back in here. And then I'll hit the API again to now see if we get that global variable populated with the right object and properties. Now looking again in monitor, the debugging, you'll see this time we've got JSON as the response. So I'm hopeful here. Going back into the global variable, let's see, what have we got? And this is looking more promising. We've got that record icon already. So there we are, the four upper parts of the objects: customer, contact details, account details, and primary contact. And you'll see we've got our inner objects, our nested objects in there too. So let's bring through some controls so that we can start using that now in our dot notation. So we've got our lookup, which is our global variable, customer, legal name. And you'll see that we can get at the properties of that response using the dot notation. So prefix it with a label. So customer dot legal name. And then adding in some others into here. some other properties, primary contact, and again, we've got that in a similar part of the global variable now, but the API response. So dot primary contact, dot first name, dot last name. And then we can bring through other parts as well. And I'm simply wrapping this into the same text block. Realize you could do this into individual controls if you so chose, or galleries or anything else that you might want to do. But in this case, I'm now going to go and bring through parts of the address. So primary address, line 1, and so on. And you'll see here we've got all parts of the address, line 1, 2, city, country, etc. Just dump in a few more bits just to build it up a little, and you'll see we've now got our full set. Now that dot notation was the important thing I wanted to show you. Now we can use that same dot notation over the API response in the test studio. So go into the global variable again, contact details, primary address, city, country. In this case, I want to say if the country is Italy, and I'll assert that in my tests. So now when it finds that the properties of that inner object are Italy, it's going to give me a true and pass the test. So very quick whistle stop how we use it. And just as a recap going through here, customer details, went into contact details, went into address, primary address, and then picked out the country property from within there. Okay, wrapping that up, if we take a view of what we've just done, although very fast, I realize, we've had object returned in our custom connector API, and that object had nested objects within it. Remember the country, it was a property of a nested object of address and so on. And the dot notation, although I went through it very fast, is the way of accessing individual parts of the object that's in that API response using that dot notation. And again, the record properties that are stored within here are indicated by the icon. So you can access in any one of those by double clicking through. I also showed you something that tripped me up for a while, and may well you too, which is that you can't read that response unless it knows it's in a JSON format. So forcing that API response in the custom connector to go back as JSON is an important thing, something to work with on your pro devs if it doesn't quite work out the way you wanted it to be during your testing cycles. And then lastly, Test Studio is great, and it can also use the same accessing of the properties using that dot notation that we mentioned before. So I'm going to take a breath, and Matt, I'm just going to throw it open if we do have any questions. I'll take some now. We're in good time, and we're finishing at 20 past, right? So I can take a few questions now if we have.
So far, you're clear. Interesting from my perspective. I never considered using just the connector without going through Power Automate, so that's an interesting thing I'd never actually thought about.
Absolutely, yeah. It was originally motivated by having some complications of wiring up Canvas apps and flows and then deploying them throughout environments, and I was really put off by this, so I wanted to find other ways.
Yeah, getting complex objects back from the flow is always the hard bit. So actually, your approach there doesn't even need it; it handles it straight away, which is much cleverer than something I thought about before.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, I'm going to go through one more example, but making this a Dataverse Dynamics example. So this isn't custom connector necessarily now. This is building out that point about using the dot notation. And we can do that with the standard connectors also. And we know that the Dataverse has an API. Canvas apps use the API. So whenever you drag through a data source of, I don't know, accounts or contacts, for example, then that is using the same API that we would do if we were to use programmatic means or custom connectors over that API, for example. So in this example, I'm going to say we have a lookup column. Now, lookup column effectively is an object, a record. So we can also do this. Notice that this isn't a child record. So we're not talking about tasks of an account or phone calls of an account here. We're talking about a lookup that goes up and away to a single record, which is an object. So we can use that. So in my simple example, I'm going to use account as a data source, and I'm going to use the primary contact to go and get some information about the primary contact. In other terminology called expand. And I'll use the dot notation again to do that. So let me just show you a very straightforward way of using this. So straight up new app, and I'm going to connect into the account by dragging through a new label. And I'm going to now use the relationship of primary contact from within this account in order to go and get some properties of that. Now, in this case, I'll just mark it up so we can see it differently, that it is not part of the account record that we're seeing on here. And if I find primary contact, I've begun my dots, as you can see. I'll select primary contact, and now can also see other lookups we might have on there would be price list, for example, and any other standard lookup that you have on the contact record or the account record, or any custom ones you can also use if you have custom ones built by your IT teams or your partners. Primary contact, take a property of that, which in my case is going to be either a created on date or modified date, or see that I can find the first name, any of the properties of that contact object or record is available to me. Okay, so some constraints. If I wanted to go from that contact to another record, another lookup from the contact, here's where we've got some limitations. So you know that a contact has an owner. If I wanted to be able to go from the account to the primary contact to the owner and bring back the email address of the owner of that contact record, that might be something I'd want to do, salesperson, owner. But this error at the top is a problem because this tells us that we can't go that far. We can only go to properties of the contact record in this situation. That's something to watch for. There are ways around that. But in this case, let me just bring through the modified date. And I'll need to mark that up and decorate it in different ways so I can make it a bit more readable in my preference. But just while it's doing that, let me reinforce one or two things here. Dataverse API is very powerful. We could use a custom connector to wrap around that also. Although in some cases we don't need to, because we've got the standard connectors in Power Automate and Flow, and we've got the direct data source from within Canvas apps. But we could also build custom connector over the front of it. And the other takeaway from that was that we don't go further than one away from the record we're on now. We can't. Although if we were to use Power Automate, we can do that. And I'll show you very shortly a graphic of how we might do that if you needed to. But this is just marked up what it was I wanted to show you. And in this case, we've now got a nice formatted label string of the modified date of the primary contact. And I can't help myself. I'll just decorate it a little more to put it in English style of date and time. Okay, so last thing we have is just a recap of this. So expanding, we can't do it. Look out for this. It will tell you in the IntelliSense here, of course, that you've got a problem, but this might not be so evident to you, either what it means or even that it was there at all. So you have to stop at this area here, so properties of the primary contact. Other constraints, you won't be able to now go down from there as easily. So if I wanted to go from account to primary contact and then bring through the tasks that are regarding that primary contact, that will be a lot more tricky to do and probably need to use Flow for that. I also trailed how we could use Flow to overcome that more than one hop away. And because the Flow, we can put in this expand query here, you'll notice that we could go, this is a different example, but I could go from contact to the account, which is parent customer ID. From that, I can expand, meaning go one more, into the currency and bring back the currency code of the currency of the account when I'm getting a contact. And that's a very useful thing to do. And so far, I haven't done so many, probably 3-4 hops away is what I've needed to do so far in my business usages of it. I haven't seen how far we can go. But that's effectively using the same dot notation, but in a different style, a different format. So this is using expand, which is effectively what that dot does when it's using the lookup columns in Dataverse. Okay, so that's through the end. Very conscious that that was real rapid. So hopefully if the content is of interest to you, go back and watch the recording. You'll see the demos there. I've deliberately done them fast so I can cover a lot of content, and we'll happily take any other questions that people have now. Thank you.
Thank you. It was great. I love a nice deep dive, quick hitting, lots.
Drinking from a fire hose, 25 minutes. Have that.
Yeah, that's what you want. But it's amazing, yeah, the power you've got with custom connectors, and especially when you can start learning Web API and expose that stuff even more. It's crazy.
Exactly right.
And especially for people that have not come from sort of a model-driven world that don't understand how the database behind the scenes works, I think from Canvas apps coming in as the entry point, it's an even bigger learning curve.
Yeah, I agree entirely.
Like I'm used to model-driven apps, so I know that I can click on owner and it takes me to an owner record, so I can visualize that in Web API. Whereas I get that for Canvas apps, like the dot notation stuff is powerful but hard to learn.
Yeah, absolutely right. So you throw it open to the floor here. What are others doing in this space? Custom connectors, and how are you finding either yourselves building Canvas apps using this dot notation and to access the JSON format? I mean, is this kind of standard routine, or are we kind of in the standard data sources, connect it into galleries type territory here?
For me, I think it depends. I think the standard galleries limit people to where they go. They don't realize they can go further. For me, you're right, absolutely. I'm with you on the dot notation side of it. That's the way I would go. Setting the variables from a flow result is normally my go-to. So now I know I don't need to do that, and I can actually just skip that entire flow stage is even more useful. But yeah, that's certainly the route I take.
I definitely joined at the wrong time. Hey, it's Reese here. I totally missed the session. I would love to have been in this because even just the discussion now sounds like something I should have been on. But in terms of that dot notation versus galleries, absolutely I use dot notation, but that's probably, as Matt was saying, my background's dynamics and model driven. So JSON is where I live.
Yeah, exactly right.
I love the Web API.
I see Matt's on the list here. Matt, if you're hearing in, what's your view, being a flow fiend?
Sorry, I'm trying to with Reese here. I missed the start of this one because I was having lunch after my presentation, so I do apologise, Rob.
No bother.
I use a lot more collections than I probably should. So whenever I want to get data from other records, I kind of collect in from there if it's more than one jump away, rather than using Flow. But you know, either way will kind of work, and it's probably a little bit better to use Flow than it is to use the collections, because collections you do hit that hard limit at 2000.
Yeah.
Which is a little disappointing, especially when you know your app is not going to live inside an actual mobile device, whether it's going to be an embedded one in model-driven apps. But yeah, usually my thing with the dot notation is I just hit dot and then just wait to see what appears. Just find
the magic
whatever it is I need. Yeah.
As a developer spending my life in Visual Studio, I've made a career of pressing the dot and see what appears.
Exactly.
Oh,
It is that
mean I'm a
revelation
developer?
moment. Great. Okay, well,
I'm going to stop the recording. If anybody is in a position to do so, if you could unmute yourselves just to give Rob a round of applause and a thank you for this. Thank you very much.
thank you very much.
I will stop the recording. I'm sure Rob is about if you want to get in touch with him at some point.
Yeah, I'll look into the chat periodically.